screen. Just bear with me, just bear with me. There we go, jolly good. So everybody can see the picture of the mosque and you can all hear me, yes? Good, so let's make a start. Well, thank you so much for joining us again in our last lecture of the present series. It's lovely to see so many people on this cold winter's night. Let's try and warm ourselves up a little bit with a little bit of sunshine from Iran. So I've called my talk Iran, the Traveler's Holy Grail. And that's because, to my mind at least whenever I've been to Iran, it's just so incredibly, enchantingly beautiful that you just walk around with your eyes almost out on stalks and your mouth is dropped open because everything is so beautiful, all the sounds, the smells of the cooking and the things, and then just the sheer friendliness of the people. All of those things contribute to make it, I always think, a fabulous place to visit. So it's without a shame of saying so, it's certainly one of my favorite destinations. It's also a huge country. There's no way we can talk about all of it this evening, but I'll do my best to at least introduce you to a portion of it, at least the portion that is probably the best known to foreign tourists. So as I said, it's a vast country with a population of 83 million. It's the second largest country in the Middle East. And it's home to one of the world's oldest civilizations, because the Elamite kingdom was founded in the 4th millennium BC. Now, in the West, historically, we've tended to refer to it as Persia. Now, that's a convention that stems from the writings of the ancient Greeks, who referred to it as the land of Persis, though in actual fact, this was just one of the provinces. It was a province around Persepolis and Shiraz. The name Iran, on the other hand, derives from Middle Persian, and it's first attested in an inscription at Naqsh-e Rustam, which we'll go and visit later, in a carving there. Incidentally and importantly, Iran, the word Iran, is the root of our English word Aryan. The two are closely connected. The main language spoken is Persian, otherwise known as Farsi, and there are many other languages, though, spoken by ethnic minorities. So, for example, Azeri, Kurdish, Armenian, Mazandarani, just to name a few. Persian is an Indo-European language, and it belongs to the family of languages that is also spoken in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and as far away as Uzbekistan. It's written using the Persian alphabet. You can see some examples of it here, which is derived from the Arabic script, but it's not exactly the same as the Arabic script. The Persians are Shiite Muslims, and we'll talk more about the religion in Persia a little bit later on. But first of all, we're going to begin our journey in Shiraz, down in the south, and I'm going to take you on a journey this evening north. So we're going to go from Shiraz up to Persepolis, then into the desert to Yazd, Isfahan, Kashan, and we're going to finish up in Tehran, just in time, hopefully, to catch our flight home. So we'll begin our journey, as I said, in Shiraz, the city that gave its name to one of the most famous wine grapes. And it seems to be no coincidence, because even today, Shiraz exudes an atmosphere of being the pleasure-loving capital of Iran. Let's take the Eram Garden, one of the most famous gardens in Iran, built in the 13th century by the chief of one of the Qashqai tribes in the area. And look at it today. I mean, you know, there's people strolling around in the park and just absolutely enjoying life, completely relaxed and at pleasure, with the beautiful palm trees, the fountain, and the decorations on the pavilion here. Incidentally, I mentioned the Qashqai. That is exactly what you thought. It's what Nissan named their car after, the Nissan Qashqai, because they wanted people to be supposedly wanderers, as it were. Because the Qashqai are nomadic, mainly Turkic peoples, even though today most of them are largely sedentary and have settled in the city of Shiraz. But nevertheless, throughout history, they've always been important power brokers throughout Iran. And sometimes that's actually even caused trouble. Gardens in Iran were and still are formal affairs. Their function is very different from our English garden. Their purpose was partly to provide a place for leisurely meetings, for people to meet up and stroll around and just talk, enjoy time together, but also for spiritual reflection. And that's very important. And that's why they're very often then laid out in a very symmetric and formal layout. So water, for example, is very important. There were very often several pools joined together by watercourses and channels. Partly this was just for symmetry, because the garden would be laid out either side of those channels. Partly it would be for the light, because the water offers a reflection. But the other reason, of course, is for the heat, because it cools the garden down. Otherwise, the other important features were things like trees and also pavilions, of course, for offering shade, because in the heat of midday, I mean, it was impossible to sit out in the gardens. Here's another of the gardens. This is Naranjistan Kawam, also in Shiraz, and those of you who speak Spanish, you've already identified the meaning of this, of the name of the villa. Naranjistan, it is the, if you like, it's the stan or the country of oranges, because the garden of this particular garden is filled with orange trees. Unfortunately, when I was there, it was November, and the fruits hadn't yet come out and the flowers had gone. So there wasn't terribly much to photograph, but one assumes that in the spring, the atmosphere would be imbued with this beautiful orange blossom scent. So, okay, just before we get to that, I'm running ahead of myself. So it's been commented on many times, but let's say it again. Our English word paradise comes from Old Iranian, from the Avestan language. Paradiesa means a walled enclosure. And it first passed into Greek as paradisos, which is a word meaning a park for animals. And in the first translations of the Bible into Greek, paradisos was the word that was used to translate the Hebrew garden as in Garden of Eden. And hence that's why paradisos, or paradise, is now used for our concept of paradise or heaven, if you like. But it comes from Old Iranian. So it was this culture of relaxation and pleasure that the Persian poet Hafez celebrated in his poetry. Hafez lived in the 14th century, but Iranians today recite his poetry as if he was a beatnik of the 1960s. Persians quote his lines off by heart as if they are proverbs. Hafiz was a Sufi, and he chiefly wrote in the style of lyric poetry or ghazals, which makes his lines very easy to remember and trip off the tongue. And when you go to visit his tomb here in Shiraz, you'll find that it's very often crowded with devotees, and a festive atmosphere abounds as they gather around to recite lines from his poems. Also in Iran, there is a tradition, you've probably heard about this, of telling fortunes. For example, looking into a coffee cup or picking a little ticket from a hat or something like that. In Persian, it's called fal. And very often the fortunes that are told are actually quotations from Hafiz. Even the Nazir al-Mulk Mosque in Shiraz has a festive air about it. It was built at the end of the 19th century in what is known as the Qajar dynasty. But for now, just notice here, this is the Mukarnas of the, we'll talk more about this later, the Ivan here. But look at the profusion of pink about it. This is very unusual for an Iranian mosque. And it has, you know, even looking at this, it's got a kind of festive air about it. But undoubtedly, the most famous part of this mosque, and this is why everybody comes to visit, is what is known as the Winter Prayer Hall, which is this hall down on the right-hand side of the courtyard. Because it's inside that courtyard, you'll notice that the windows have got this fabulous stained glass. So it's not just the stained glass that has this beautiful coloring and lovely light. It's also the light that it casts on the carpets, creating these beautiful and intricate patterns. And whenever you go to visit this Winter Prayer Hall, it's always full. Not, as you imagine, perhaps with people praying, but following that other Iranian obsession of taking photos or selfies. If they're not taking photos of themselves, they're taking photos of each other. And this is pretty much how they pass the time. And they're quite happy, you know, for other people to take photos of them, and they enjoy posing for photographs. So whilst in Shiraz, a visit to the bazaar is I think absolutely compulsory. I mean, it's so full of color. I mean, here we are in the textile stalls. Look at all these beautiful different cloths of different types. And then of course, all the fruits. We were there at the time when the pomegranates were ripe, but also look at all the different spices here, cinnamon and so forth. Absolutely dozens and dozens of textile sellers selling every imaginable type of cloth that you could possibly want to buy. And also just the sheer numbers of different people passing through the bazaar. In Shiraz, you quite often come across people like this. This man is not from Iran. He's from Afghanistan. You can tell by his turban and also the way that he wears his beard. But nevertheless, this is quite a common sight in the bazaars of Shiraz. I'd like to say something a little bit about the mosques in Iran, in particular the mosque architecture. We'll talk about the religion later, but let's for now talk a little bit about the architecture. So those of you who've been to Turkey, for example, Iranian mosques are very different from Turkish mosques. So they very often have a dome. Unfortunately, it's not in this photo, but I'll show you one later. The dome of an Iranian mosque tends to be a little bit more egg-shaped than the Turkish dome of a mosque. But the most important part of an Iranian mosque is the courtyard. where we are here. And on the four sides of the courtyard are prayer halls and also the medres, which are the classrooms and the schools for teaching the Quran to the young, to the children, boys and girls. So the courtyard, of course, can also be used to accommodate people praying. They can bring carpets and mats and spread them down and pray here. But invariably, there's also a pool in the middle of the courtyard, and this serves as two functions. One, of course, to provide a little bit of coolness, but the other is also as a mirror, just as in this photograph here, so that you get the reflection of, this is the Ivan, which we'll come to in a moment. For sure, there are always minarets. Again, I've got more photographs later on to show you the minarets. But the most important feature of an Iranian mosque is this arch, which is known as an Ivan or Iwan, spelt I-W-A-N or I-V-A-N. And it's quite simply a vaulted rectangular space, closed on three sides and open on one side. And you'll see these as well are also known as Ivans. And once you identify that, wherever you look in Iran, you see these Ivans. Notice also the shape of the arch. It's very different from the arch, the Arab style arch that you will see, for example, in Sicily. And this Ivan can be traced back originally to a palace about a couple of hours drive from Shiraz at a place called Firuzabad, a place that's known of the Palace of Ardashir. Ardashir was the founder, the first ruler of the Sasanian Empire. We'll talk about those in a moment. And this was his palace, dating from the early part of the 3rd century AD. And here, lo and behold, is the Ivan. And it's a very early example of a vaulted space. And if there's any architects among you, you will know that the history of vaulting a space is a very interesting one. I mean, for example, if you take the Pantheon in Rome, which is a dome, dates from the 1st century AD. If you remember it, it's not a complete dome because it's open to the sky at the top. If they were to actually complete it, they say that there was the risk that the dome could have fallen in. So this early vaulting of the Persians was, in a way, a solution to this problem. Robert Byron visited Firuzabad in 1934. And he wrote about it in his book, The Road to Oxiana. If you haven't read it, I can recommend it. It is one of the great reads. He was traveling around Iran and Afghanistan in the 1930s. We have to say, in some style, he had a servant. They bought a motor car in Tehran and drove around a bit, but when they couldn't drive, they rode around on horseback. But he has some interesting comments about this palace, the Palace of Ardashir, because he says that without this building, buildings such as St. Peter's in Rome and the Taj Mahal could not have been built. So in terms of the history of architecture, this building is that important. All right, we'll move on from Shiraz now and we'll go to Persepolis. But just before we do, we're in danger. I'm aware that, especially in Iran, we're coming across probably new terms, new empires and so on that are maybe a little bit unfamiliar. So let's do a little bit of revision on these. So the earliest empire that we're going to talk about today was the Achaemenid Empire, which began in 550 BC and went up to 330 BC. So it's kind of contemporary with the ancient Greeks, if you think about it, the classical Greeks, if you like. was founded by Cyrus. We'll talk about him in a moment. And then the reign passed on to his son Darius, his son Xerxes, and then his son Artaxerxes. And thereafter there were numerous other kings, all with the same names, Darius and Xerxes, and so forth. That then came to an end with the conquest of Iran by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Remember last week we talked about how he arrived in the west of Turkey. He then moved all the way through Asia Minor into Iran, and then eventually to the Indus Valley, where of course he died a few years later. But nevertheless, he was the one that was responsible for destroying the Achaemenid Empire. And thereafter, of course, he died a few years later, and his lands passed to his generals, in particular the general Seleucus, who then founded the Seleucid Empire. So most of the territory of Iran then fell under that. And what didn't then also fell under the Parthians. I mean, the Parthians and the Seleucids were, there was a lot of war between the two of them. We're not going to talk very much about them this evening. But the other important empire, which you have to remember, is the Sasanian Empire, which began with Ardashir, he of the palace of Ardashir that we just talked about a couple of moments ago, began in 224 AD, and it lasted until 651 AD. The other important ruler of the Sasanian Empire was Ardashir's son, Shapur, and we'll mention him in a moment as well. After 651, in 651, we had the Islamic conquest of Persia. After which, of course, Persia became Muslim. And as I said, we'll talk more about religion a little bit later on. So prior to 651, Persia, or Iran, was not Muslim at all. We'll come to that a little bit in a moment. So those are just the names to try and remember as I go through the rest of the talk, if that's possible. So we're going to go to Persepolis, but before we get there, we're going to stop a couple of miles down the road at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, who was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire that, as I said, spanned from 550 to 330 BC. Now, the Achaemenids were a nomadic people who had settled in the Zagros region of northwest Iran around 1000 BC. But then they were rallied under the rule of Cyrus the Great, and under his rule, the empire expanded and it embraced all the previous civilized states of the ancient Near East in a kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean, from Greece, from Western Anatolia, the whole of Anatolia, Persia, and then right through to the Indus Valley in the east. Cyrus today is recognized for his achievements in human rights, in politics, in military strategy. It was him, remember, who defeated the Lydians in Western Anatolia in the siege of Sardis in 547 BC. And that's why the Iranians of today very much regard him as the father of their modern nation. I've never been here at Newroz. Newroz is the Persian festival of spring on the 21st of March, but I'm told that, you can't get anywhere near this tomb because they all come here. Everybody comes here to pay respects. And Cyrus the Great was certainly a much greater ruler than Alexander the Great, who ironically, of course, ultimately was to destroy the empire of which Cyrus was a founder. And as I said later on, after Cyrus, the kings that came after him were Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and so forth. So Cyrus founded Persepolis, and Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. The name, of course, is not actually Persian. It's derived from the Greek, Persepolis, in other words, the city of the Persians. But to call it a city is actually probably not quite correct, because it certainly wasn't a city in the way that Rome or Athens or even Constantinople was a city. Because the Achaemenids were nomadic, and they spent most of the year riding around the steppes, around the deserts, around Anatolia, fighting and so forth. So probably Persepolis was something more like just their winter quarters. And historians still argue about this. We think that probably they kept a kind of staff all year round. But if you think, probably for 9 or 10 months of the year, the place was pretty much deserted. Probably it was only for a couple of months a year that Cyrus, Darius, and so forth would have actually come to inhabit it. And that makes it all the more incredible, its existence. Most of its construction actually was not done during the reign of Cyrus. It was done during the reign of his son, Darius, and it was completed in the reign of his son, Xerxes. This here is the gate to one of the palaces in Persepolis. Some splendid statues here adorning the gate. But one of the incredible things, unfortunately, you can't see it in this photograph, but as you walk up the step and you look on the left-hand side, there is a piece of graffiti there, and I forget exactly what it says, but it says something to the like of Captain so-and-so was here 1834. Some English captain had passed through Persepolis and scrawled his name on the side of the wall. So all manner of people have passed through Persepolis in history. This is a rather nice picture. This is one of the capitals, originally, of course, holding up the vaulting, but featuring this double-headed griffin, which is used very much as a symbol nowadays of Persepolis and Iran. The very important thing, though, is are the fabulous friezes that line the north stairway going up to the Abadan, and the Abadan is one of the palaces. This is just part of it, this here, and this part is actually in the National Archaeological Museum in Tehran. You can see them in Persepolis, they're there, but they're a little bit more difficult to photograph because of the light, but in the museum you get a better light like this. This here is King Xerxes, and notice that he's holding in his hand, this is a lotus flower. The lotus flower is a symbol of reconciliation and peace for the Achaemenids, and also it's reminiscent of spring, of rebirth, and of new life. And it's a symbol that occurs frequently throughout Persepolis. So Persepolis, of course, this grand complex of palaces, was entirely destroyed and then subsequently looted by Alexander the Great on his march through Persia in 330 BC. Now, Robert Byron, who of course also came here, he makes the interesting assertion that actually the columns of Persepolis look far more spectacular today than they would have done when it was complete. Because at least today, here they are puncturing the sky, whereas when the palaces were here, they've actually been quite dark beneath the roof and the vault and so forth. An interesting observation, I think. So we're going to leave Persepolis and we're going to go about just 5 miles down the road to a place that I mentioned before, Naqsh-e Rustam. And this is essentially a rock face, a cliff face in the mountainside, into which the Achaemenid kings carved the tombs for their burial. This particular one here is the tomb of Darius the Great, the son of Cyrus. Unfortunately, there's not I could do with a person in this picture to give you some idea of scale, but to give you some idea, this doorway, a person can pass through that doorway without crouching down, just to give you some idea of how huge it is. There's no way of getting up there, you can't go into it, there's no ladder or anything like that. And there are 3 or 4 of these side by side. Just a detail of this, if you look at the upper part of this carving here, this relief, this is another photo, slightly easier to see. I would like to point out this symbol at the top, because we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a while. This is the carving of Ahura Mazda, or the symbol of the Faravahar, the symbol of the Zoroastrians here at the top. And as I say, we'll come to that in a short while. But for the moment, let's just go back to this. And I want to concentrate our attention on this carving down here. This is not contemporary with the tomb of Darius. In fact, it comes from 550 years later, from the reign of Shapur. Shapur was the son of Ardashir. He was one of the Sasanian emperors. Let's just go back and remind ourselves. So Darius was one of the Achaemenids. Shapur was one of the Sasanians. So 550 years later. What does this relief depict? Well, this is Shapur here on horseback, and down to beside him, this gentleman here kneeling down is pleading for his life. This is the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, when he was taken prisoner in battle by the Persians. Quite an extraordinary thing for the Romans to lose an emperor as a prisoner in battle to the Persians. Quite what happened to Valerian, historians are divided as to his final fate. Some of them colourfully say that he was used as a footstool by Shapur whenever Shapur wanted to get onto his horse. Other people say that he was flayed alive, and other people said that he just became a slave and spent the last of his days there. So the Sasanian Empire, therefore, was to span from the capture of the Roman emperor right up to the middle of the 7th century to 651 AD, as I mentioned before. And that was the conquest of the Muslims of the country or the territory of Iran. So prior to 651, Iran had the most important religion had been the Zoroastrian religion. That's the religion that I alluded to when I mentioned the carving up here. So let's go and talk about the Zoroastrian religion. And in doing so, we're going to take a journey into the desert to, and beyond that, to the city of Yazd. Here we are in our bus driving along. Our driver, he seemed to like to have this little model of an airplane on the dashboard. So after about 4 or 5 hours drive through the desert from Persepolis, we arrive in Yazd. Now, excuse me, you can't quite see this. This says up at the top here, Zoroastrian Fire Temple in Yazd. Yazd has been a center of Zoroastrian since the 3rd century AD. And then after that, it remained a center of Zoroastrianism even under the Muslim rule by paying a levy, a kind of tax to the Islamic rulers. And even today, even though Islam is the dominant religion in the city of Yazd, Zoroastrianism still exists. I ought to say that you can't convert to become a Zoroastrian. You can only inherit it from one of your parents, or probably usually it's both of your parents. And that's why, of course, the Zoroastrians have tended to die out. But the other thing is that after the Islamic conquest of Iran, many of them fled. They fled to India. So you get a lot of Zoroastrians there. And there they became extremely successful. They are known in the business world in India. So, for example, the Mazda car company is originally was founded by the Zoroastrians. Just to remind ourselves a little bit about what the Zoroastrian religion entails, well, it's based around the duality of the struggle between good and evil. It's based on the teachings of Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as he's sometimes known, and the most important text is the Attested. Now, Zoroaster proclaimed that Ahura Mazda, who is this chap here, was the supreme creator and is the sustaining force of the universe, and that human beings have a choice into whether they want to support him or not. But it's a very optimistic religion because they believe that ultimately good will triumph over evil. Why is it called a fire temple? Well, because fire is a primary symbol of the Zoroastrians. Now, I haven't seen it because I wasn't allowed to go into the temple. If you're not a Zoroastrian, you're not allowed in there. But inside this temple is a sort of brazier with a fire that is kept burning continually. It has been burning ever since this temple was built in the 1930s, and the fire was brought here from another temple where the fire had been burning for at least 1,500 years before that. So it's a very ancient and, excuse me, fascinating religion. So the other feature of the Zoroastrian religion is how they dispose of their dead. And at least in the past, they would take their deceased up to these, what are known as the Towers of Silence. These are up on the mountains just outside of Yazd. These buildings that you can see around are the buildings where the people who serviced all of this, the workers who took the dead up to the Towers of Silence, they lived. Here's another photograph here. And this is a photograph from looking down onto it from the top. You can see you can't see, I couldn't get right over the top of it, but essentially it's just a hollow space inside. It doesn't go down very far. It only goes down perhaps about 10 meters. And of course, the corpse would have been taken in through this door and then just laid out to rest. And the vultures who are circling overhead nearby then would have come down and picked the corpse clean, and then the bones would have been taken away and buried. Nowadays, the Zoroastrians are no longer permitted to do that, and they have to bury their dead in a cemetery nearby, or possibly in some places they actually cremate them. So the other interesting architectural feature of Yazd, which I want to talk about now, is the qanats. Now, I don't have any photographs of qanats because qanats are under the ground, but you get some idea by looking at this territory. So on the left-hand side of the picture, these are the foothills of the mountains which actually extend for many, many miles off to the left of this picture. And to the right, this is the city of Yazd. This is the desert, and then further beyond the city of Yazd is fields and so forth. So what then are these qanats? A qanat is essentially a channel or an aqueduct cut in through the rock to reach a water source, an aquifer, if you like, and then which takes the water from that water source to the city. And these qanats were first dug in Iran, in the area around Yazd, in the first millennium BC. And then they gradually diffused throughout the Arab world. The Greeks adopted this technology, and those of you that can cast your minds back to the theatre in Syracuse will remember that there is a fountain that gushes out into it, and behind that fountain is an aqueduct. Essentially, that is a qanat. The city of Palermo in Arab times was served by a qanat bringing water from the mountains. It's extraordinary how they actually built these qanats or dug these qanats. It was an extraordinary technological feat, I always think. So first of all, they would dig a shaft down in the mountains to find the water. And once they'd done that, they would start at this end here and dig backwards towards the water. How they knew that that was where they were going to end up, I always think is extraordinary. And then every so often, these access shafts were dug down. And of course, it was very important to get the gradient right. Too steep, and the water would tumble over itself, and it would erode the channel. Too shallow, and of course, it wouldn't flow enough. So these qanats are the lifeblood of Yazd in more ways than one, because not only do they provide water, but they also provide the cooling system of the city. Because wherever you go in Yazd, you come across these towers. These are known as wind catchers, and they provide a system of air conditioning to the buildings. It's quite complex the way it works. People have written their PhD theses on this, and if you're interested, go and look it up. But essentially, they work in conjunction with the qanats. A short distance away from this building, there would be a shaft sunk down to reach the qanat, which would draw the warm air from roundabout. Warm air would descend. It would be cooled by the cool water, carried along by the current, and then it would ascend into the building. And then there was a sort of system of moving the air around, and it would come out of these if you chimneys here. But there were other functions as well, because they also literally caught the wind, and the wind could come in, and there was a whole system of funneling inside this tunnel here. So complex and interesting subject for anybody who cares to study it. But wherever you go in Yazd, you see these wind catchers. Also, you come across these ice houses. They brought ice down from the mountains, kept them in these structures like this, and then they could use the ice throughout the winter, throughout the summer, I mean. Famous mosque in Yazd. Sorry, we're missing the titles there. There we go. Maybe I can move it like that. There we go. This is the Jame Mosque in Yazd. You can see here the fabulous minarets. You notice that blue is the predominant color of all mosque architecture in Iran. And you go inside into the courtyard, and of course, what do you find? You find more people taking photographs of each other. This is, as I said, the national pastime of young Iranians. This was us. This was one of our groups in the bazaar, buying headscarves, head shawls, so that we could go out and about. Of course, as you'll know, women have to cover their heads, but it's not like Saudi Arabia. You don't have to sort of wear a chador or anything. You can notice that some of the group here with their headscarves that they've bought and they're trying on. It's just enough to sort of cover the crown of the head. And we had a lot of fun this day buying our headscarves. So we're going to leave Yazd now, and we're going to head towards Isfahan. Now, Isfahan has a very long history. I'm not going to talk about all of it, but it is undoubtedly the most beautiful city in the whole of Iran. It gained its importance during the Safavid period. And the Safavid period was from the beginning of the 16th century up to the middle of the 18th century. The most important ruler of the Safavid period was Shah Abbas. And you've probably heard his name. He reigned from 1588 to 1629. And under Shah Abbas, he completely reconstructed the city. And the most famous thing that he did was to lay out this Naqsh-e which is essentially the city square around which the rest of the city is organized. It's a slightly funny photograph, this. I had to do a pano shot. It's the only way I could get it in, because it's 800 meters from one end to another. And when Shah Abbas created this, so where I'm taking the photograph from is up here. This was his pavilion, Ali Kapur. And he would sit up here on the balcony and look down, and this was essentially a polo pitch. It was where they played polo. But in due course, it was formalized and made into this beautiful garden. Around the four sides of Naqsh-e you can see these are shops. It's like a kind of formal bazaar. You can buy anything you like in these shops. Two mosques. This was the private mosque of the Shah. We'll talk about that in a moment. And here on the right-hand side, you can just make out this was the public mosque. This is the Shah Mosque, also known as the Imam Mosque. Here you get an idea of the shape of the dome. Unfortunately, the last time I was there, it was actually being restored. This is scaffolding up against it. Notice also that the mosque is skewed in orientation from the rest of the square because, of course, it has to face Mecca. And it's considered one of the great wonders of Islamic architecture in Iran. This here again is the courtyard, and this famous courtyard, it actually has 4 Ivans. There's only one in the photograph here, but in each of the 3 sides, there are 3 other great Ivans like this. And also notice the Ivans here. We can wander around the complex. It's absolutely vast. And it's just beautiful everywhere you go with this incredible mosaic tiling. But I think the real wonder, everybody says the real wonder of Isfahan is the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, which, as I said, is the right against the Ali Kapur. There was a tunnel through which the Shah could pass to get to the mosque. If you notice, rather interestingly, it's lopsided. So the dome is to one side of the entrance, but it's as if it doesn't really matter. It's still beautiful. This here is the Ivan, again, with what we call mukarnas decoration inside here. This is in the sunlight, last sun of the day. But it's inside this mosque, which is utterly just astonishingly beautiful. This beautiful gold color, nobody really knows what creates it. It's not as if it's stained glass. It's just the light and the reflection of the light on these tiles. And then you look up into the dome and you see this. And again, there's always this sort of, this is not a shadow, of course, this is a beam of light. and it's coming through one of the windows, and it's the way that the light plays on there, and it moves around during the day. Extraordinarily beautiful. Then you come out, of course, and lo and behold, there's some children waiting to have their photograph taken. I said I'd say something about religion in Iran. So just very briefly, I don't know where we're going, a little bit over time, but nevertheless. So the predominant religion in Iran is Shiite, the Shiite Islam. But until Shah Abbas, in other words, until Isfahan, the dominant religion in Iran was Sunnism. So what, therefore, is the difference between Sunnism and Shiism? Sunnism, as you'll probably know, is the vast majority of Muslims throughout the world, certainly in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and so on, are Sunnis. Iran is really where we find most of the Shiites. So what is the difference? Well, Shiites believe that after the death of Muhammad, the true successor was Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, who was the husband of Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. And the Shiites believe that Muhammad, during his life, on several occasions, he designated Ali as his successor. But what happened is, after the death of Muhammad, the close family, including Ali and so forth, they were in mourning around Muhammad's body. And meanwhile, a group of tribal leaders from Mecca held a conference because they believed that Muhammad never designated a successor. And during their conference, they nominated Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's father-in-law, to be the first caliph. So, in other words, from the very first days after Muhammad's death, there was a disagreement between those who believed that Ali was the true successor of Muhammad and those who believed that the first caliph, Abu Bakr, was indeed the true successor. And that schism has maintained till today. The other important mosque in Isfahan is the Jame Mosque. This is an older mosque. This predates the other two mosques I told you about. I put it in here because the prayer halls are stunning. They're divided up into these little squares, if you like, and each one has a dome with entirely different brickwork in it. Utterly incredible brickwork. If I mentioned a squinch before, I don't know whether I did, but this is a good example of a squinch here. There are several squinches. It's a way, an architectural term, explaining basically how you move from a square shape to a rounded dome. The other thing in Isfahan is this very famous bridge, the Kaju Bridge, over a river. Unfortunately, as you can see, there's no water in the river today. That's because, unfortunately, there's a dam that's been built upstream, and whereas once upon a time the water flowed between these steps, it still does occasionally. A couple of months a year they open the dam, but most of the time it's dry like this. But still, it produces a very pretty photograph in the nighttime. And then, I mean, we're getting near to the end now, near to the end of our journey. Just want to take you to Kashan. Kashan is a small town, really, not very much to particularly point out historically, but it's very beautiful. It's at the bottom of these mountains. And these were just photographs that I took wandering around early one morning. Came across the bakers making the bread. And then into the bazaar here. And then you come into this kind of open courtyard here, or covered courtyard. I have no idea what it's for, what it's used for really, but people just seem to congregate here. And typically, as usual, they just sit and enjoy having their photographs taken. just as these two ladies were doing here. And also this gentleman, this was the man who served the tea in the bazaar. Didn't really have time to talk about Persian food, but of course this is one of the other great things about a visit to Iran. Lots of rice, vegetables, nuts, yogurts, and lots of green leaves as well. And then finally we come to Tehran. Well, what to say about Tehran? It's a vast city. This was the view outside from my hotel room. This was a nice day looking across to the Alborz mountains. Tehran has a lot of fantastic things. I don't have a lot of photographs of Tehran because a lot of them are places where you can't photograph. So the old palaces of the Shah, the crown jewels, and so forth. But an extraordinary city, and really one that you will never forget. And then, you know, just wandering around, we find ourselves in this, I'd like to say a bar, but it's not quite a bar, of course, because it doesn't serve alcohol, it just served coffee and so forth. But, you know, you could almost be anywhere else in sort of Berlin or London or Rome or anywhere else in Tehran. So we're pretty much there. Just to finish off with, I'd like to share with you a couple of videos. And if I remembered to share the sound with you, you'll hear the sound on these videos as well. So the first one is, this is something I took off Instagram from just 3 days ago, just a view of Tehran. And the other one, I wasn't really sure whether I should show it to you, but I will anyway. This is driving through Tehran, which is an experience in itself.
یعنی روزای طلایی یه شب خوب دوتایی من کنارت بیقرارم عشق خودتی با موی مشکی نگم از تو خود عشقی نگم از حالی که دارم میقرارم ای وای از تو دلشو ندارم بری.
All right, well, you get the idea. Anyway, all right, well, that's the end of my presentation. So let's come back into the room. I've gone a little bit over time, but there is time for questions if anybody would like. If you'd like to unmute yourselves, Lara, if you'd like to allow people to unmute themselves, do feel free to put up your hand and fire away with a question or comment or anything like that.
Damien, it's Tina.
Tina, hi, nice to see you. Yes.
Hi. I was just wondering, I think in Isfahan, I think it was the Shah's mosque, there seemed to be a cross, a small cross. It was like a standard with a cross on it. It was just that off to the right of the entrance.
Was that in one of my photographs, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe it was just a coincidence because it was meant to have a sign hung on it or something, but it was just a curious thing to see outside a mosque.
How observant of you, Tina. I don't think it's a cross. I'm going to have to go back and look at it again. I'm not going to do it now because I don't think it's a cross. You don't come across many crosses in.
No, I didn't think so.
except actually, yes, in Isfahan, and I didn't show you this, but there is actually a large Armenian community in Isfahan, and they were brought to Isfahan by Shah Abbas because of their connections with Europe and their merchants. And so they built a church, and there, yes, there are lots of crosses, but not, I don't think, in the Shah Mosque. But anyway, well observed, Tina. Thank you. Anybody else?
Damien?
Yes. Oh, Caroline, hello there.
Hi.
You'll remember some of those photos.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, I was just going to say the word in Arabic for paradise is garden. So the gardens have "you are in paradise."
There you go. There you go. Yes. So Caroline speaks Arabic. So thank you, Caroline, for bringing that one up. So that completes the circle. And yes, thank you. Good. Anybody else?
Yes, Damien, it's Kate.
Yes. Oh, Kate. Hello there. Nice to see you.
Yeah. In Persepolis, where the picture of the statue, of Xerxes, his
Yes.
beard, was it his beard? It looks very Egyptian. Is it a beard or is it some sort of cloth?
It is a beard. Yes, exactly. It is. It's very, very similar. You're quite right. Yes.
Was there a connection between the two?
There wasn't, but I think it was probably just the artistic way of
The fashion.
portraying the curls of a beard. I think that's what it was. But you're absolutely right. It's very, very similar indeed. And if you weren't to know, you would think so. And I didn't, unfortunately, I haven't got a photograph of that stairway, as I mentioned, but it's a very interesting stairway because it's a procession of all the people under the Achaemenid Empire. So you get Greeks, you get Armenians, you get Georgians, you get goodness knows what. I don't think you actually get Egyptians though. I think, from memory, I can't remember any, but it's interesting because you see all their different hairstyles and their different beards, and then also their different noses. So that's a good comment and a good observation. Thank you. Time for one last question, if anybody has one. Otherwise, it might be.
Can you just tell us the name of Robert Byron's book again?
Yes, it's called Road to Oxiana. It's the only one that he wrote, and it's available, I think, in Penguin or on what's that thing called?
Amazon.
Amazon. Yes, Amazon. Yes. Thank you.
Oxian spelled?
Sorry.
How is Oxian spelled?
Oxiana, Oxiana.
Oh, I did it. All right. Okay.
Yes, well done. And I can recommend it. It's a fantastic book. Really fantastic read. Yeah. Well, listen, we've gone a little bit over time, so I think we're going to have to wrap up there. But I'd like to say, just in sort of conclusion, really, thank you so much to all of you for joining us in all of these lectures. It's been, I was saying this morning, it's been really good fun. You know, you've been my family in the last couple of months, in these weekly meetings, and I'm going to miss it. But we're not going to stop because, as I said, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to start with Roz is going to do the food lectures in Sicily. And we've got a series of 5 on there. If you didn't get the email, get in touch with me, send me an email, and I'll gladly send you out all the details. So thank you. Stay well, get the vaccine, stay healthy, and let's all look forward to better times, which are not very far away, I think.
Are you in Sicily or in England?
I'm in Sicily.
So
and I'm likely to be here for a while.
And the vaccines are coming your way?
Well, I won't be able to get one here in Sicily. I'm going to have to come back to England. But Sicily, funnily enough, they are rolling them out in Sicily, mainly to the medical profession. They get the priority here, but they are coming. So fingers crossed.
Damien, thank you so much. It was a most interesting lecture.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, Damien.
Take care to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye, Ken.
Thank you very much,
Bye,
Damien.
Tina. Thank you.